We are talking about the number one controversy in the Olympics right now, and that is Imane Khelif. Now, if you haven't heard about this yet, she is an amateur boxer. The Olympics only allows amateur boxers from Algeria. And there are questions around, is she a man, is she a woman? And this was really brought to light when she fought an Italian opponent. And 46 seconds into the match, the opponent quit crying because she was hit one time. Now, let's go into this a little bit. It's not as cut and dry as you guys might think, and I think there's a lot of misinformation out there about this. Born in 1999, Aman is 5'10", 66 kilos, a relatively small person, and she has a record of 43-9. Now, 4 of those were disqualified because she was banned by the International Boxing Association for having these ambiguous sort of gender identity things. Now, the IBA, when they tested her, said that she had very high levels of testosterone and she had some XY chromosomes. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's first address the IBA, which is not necessarily the most ethical, most reliable source. When Aman was disqualified, the outcome was that there was a Russian athlete who became undefeated because that defeat was null and void. The IBA is a Russian-run federation, and if we haven't learned anything about Russian bending of the rules over the past several years, just look back to the Sochi Olympics and let me know how you go. But Aman, when she grew up, she really has a true Olympic story. And I am going to get to the gender discrepancies. I know some people are probably upset right now. I do have a conclusion here. But she's a true like Olympic hero story where she sold scrap metal to afford training. She grew up in Algeria. Her dad was not supportive of her boxing because boxing is not something that women do. But we do get to the fighting. We get to what's called DSD, which is differences in sex development. This is not a real diagnosis. It's just saying that you're somewhere along the intersex spectrum. And one thing I want to be really clear is that there's no allegation whatsoever that this is any sort of transgender issue. This is someone who lies somewhere along the genetic spectrum biologically that is trying to compete. If it was a former man that is now competing as a woman, I would have a very different conversation about that, especially when it comes to combat sports. But let's get back. So she said allegedly, or the IBA said allegedly she had high testosterone and XY chromosomes. And if we look at female testosterone, that normally exists somewhere between 15 and 70. Male testosterone exists somewhere between 270 and 1070. If you want to get your testosterone checked, I've popped a link for blokes down below. That's where I get my blood work done, and you can take care of your health that way as well. Now, why might a woman have high testosterone? Why might a woman have XY chromosomes when externally they are 100% woman? There's nothing that you could see on them that would make you question anything about their gender. And there are really several different reasons, all falling under the DST category. There's polycystic ovarian syndrome, which would be the most common, and virtually everyone watching this video would know someone with that condition. Swyer syndrome and androgen insensitivity syndrome. These syndromes, they can have XY chromosomes associated. Not all of them, but all of them do result in higher levels of testosterone. We're talking up to 3,000. The upper limit normal for males is 1,070. Now, externally, they're female, 100% female, but internally, they're male. One complication with this is it's very common for these people to actually not even know that they're anywhere along any sort of spectrum. They exist as a woman. Oftentimes, they can't get pregnant, and then they go to the doctor only to find out that internally, they might have undescended testes. They might have one testy and one ovary. There's a lot of different situations by which they may be infertile or they may be unwell at some point, but it's not a nefarious thing. There's no wrongdoing here at all for people who have these conditions. And I think when we see something like this, we have to go back to what is the precedence? There's the whole question of what is a woman, what is not a woman when it comes to competing in sport that has obviously become a huge talking point in recent history. But when it comes to intersex people, it's hard. You really don't know. Of course, you would never see an intersex person competing with the men because If they had some female characteristics based on the average performance of men and women, they would have a very difficult time making it to the Olympics. So this really just becomes a conversation about women's sport and maintaining the integrity of women's sport. So the IBA alleges that the IOC determines gender based on the athlete's passport documentation, which is completely untrue. So at Rio in 2016, I have a friend who runs 800 meters, or she did run 800 meters at a very high level, and she brought attention to me about this race in 2016, the women's 800 meters. You look at the picture of the podium, and you definitely have some questions of what's going on here. Now, it was won by Caster Semenya, but all of these women, all three of these podium finishers, they had genetic defects to make them intersex, but they were allowed to compete. Now, they were allowed to compete in the 800 meter, but they weren't allowed to compete in the 400 meter. That was seen as too much of an advantage. They all had high testosterone, they all had XY chromosomes, and they were all allowed to compete. Now, they are all now banned. I don't get it. I don't understand. Where is the IOC saying this is where we're a man, this is where we're a woman? But they were allowed in the past, and they're not right now. Now, since they're not right now, we go back to Aman. Well, Aman is virtually under the same, well, obviously we don't know their medical situation, but they seem to be under the same category, but they're allowed to compete. So, to me, Iman is a girl. She is not an unbelievably dominant boxer. She's 43-9. It's good, but if you think of anyone, and this is amateur, this is only amateur, if she went up against pros, she'd be absolutely demolished. She's never identified as a man. She has a genetic advantage that gives male hormones a makeup, but is genetic advantage against the rules? And what are the rules? If we couldn't have genetic advantages, well, you couldn't be a basketball player who's tall. You couldn't be a boxer who's tall. You couldn't be a water polo player with lighter bones. You couldn't be a swimmer with Marfan syndrome. But combat sports should be treated with an extra level of security, like I said before. And somehow it's become less strict than track and field. To me, should Aman be competing? I say no. I say no because there's a genetic advantage that is related to her being somewhere in between a male and a female. But we should have a much higher level of empathy and compassion because she is not trying to break any rules. She may or may not have even known that she was intersex before she was tested by the IBA, and those results may or may not be valid because the IBA is a Russian federation who just made a Russian go back to being undefeated. There are definitely question marks there. So I think the vitriol is a bit too much, and I think the allowing her to compete is the incorrect call, but it's not as egregious as you might think. I would love to know your guys' thoughts. Go ahead, pop the comments in the description. As per usual, lift heavy and be kind, and we will catch you in the next video.